The Dashman Company is a manufacturer of equipment for the armed forces. In the 1940s, they realized they were having an issue with acquiring raw materials. With 20 plants located across the country, they decided to appoint a VP of purchasing to centralize purchasing efforts and ensure that all plants had the necessary raw materials. Mr. Post was appointed for this role, with Mr. Larson serving as his executive assistant. The first change implemented by Mr. Post was to require plant purchasing executives to receive home office approval for contracts exceeding $10,000. He decided to communicate this change via a written memo. 6 weeks after the memo was sent, some plants had acknowledged receipt of the communication, but had not received a single contract for approval. Team Back in Black has identified 3 issues with how Mr. Post chose to communicate his message. Tanya, do you have any insight?
The first issue that we identified had to do with Mr. Post not knowing his audience. Communication is not about the communicator. It's all about the audience. You have to know the audience and understand them in order to achieve your purpose. According to Bovey and Thiel, you must know the expectations of the audience, their preferences, and their possible reactions to what is being communicated. In Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, that was written in 1936 and still popular today, he was the first to really give us the interconnection between interpersonal relationships and effective managerial skills. He said that to influence people, you must listen, and you must show interest in the person's concern, and you have to gain their confidence. So in our case study, Mr. Post is new to the organization, and he's only met a few of the executives. He decides to write the letter, as Rachel, that you shared, and he seeks the input from Mr. Larson to see if the content of the letter is good. Mr. Larson tells him he thinks the content's excellent, but advises Mr. Post that he should meet with the purchasing executives personally. This gives us some insight into the fact that Mr. Larson knew what the possible responses might be, knew what the expectations and the preferences of the purchasing managers might be.
Thank you so much for that insight, Tanya. Mark, what would you have suggested that he could have done differently?
Well, actions to fix the communication breakdown would be for Mr. Post to build relationships with different purchasing managers throughout the country. At the time of the letter was sent, Mr. Post had not developed any credibility with the managers. This could have been done by visiting the purchasing managers one-on-one or bringing them all to corporate headquarters to explain the situation and the importance of centralizing purchases. Considering your audience can only help when you are building relationships and establishing credibility. Questions like, who is my audience? What do they know about this topic? What is their attitude toward this topic and toward me? And what is my attitude toward them can go a long way in getting your point across. According to Bovey and Thiel, face-to-face interaction is helpful in complex, emotionally charged situations in which establishing or fostering a business relationship is important.
Thank you, Mark and Tanya, for your insight.
Thanks.
Anna, do you have anything to add?
Yes, Rachel. As a matter of fact, another key component was the mode of communication that Mr. Post selected to deliver the message, which was a written letter.
Rasan, what do you think he could have done differently?
According to Robert Hayes' article, A Brief History of Internal Organization Communication Through the 1940s, he often referenced Alex Heron. Heron's thinking is communication is a line function. It's a two-way chain of information. Communication requires the freedom and opportunity to ask questions, get answers, and exchange ideas. Face-to-face communication is more interactive versus written. I recommend both face-to-face and written communication. Mr. Larson, who is Mr. Post's assistant, could have arranged for all the purchasing managers to meet at a central location in order to, 1, meet Mr. Post for the first time, and secondly, to allow Mr. Post to communicate his ideas to the purchasing team. This would allow for his ideas to be communicated more effectively and get the change that he wanted.
Thanks for that, Rasan. Anna, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I would also add that timing was essential in the communication. Mr. Post decided to implement this change during a difficult yet crucial time, the peak purchasing season. When the letter was sent out, Dashman Company was 3 weeks away from peak purchasing season. Mr. Post informed his team that they must send him a letter notifying him of any negotiations that were $10,000 or more within a week of signing the contract.
Mr. Post could have reached out to the other plants through telegraph and telephone to expedite dialogue concerning the peak purchasing season. In reference to the ON strategy, it is critical to give your employees sufficient time to make any changes in workflow to comply with new directions.
Thank you so much for the insight. Sean, what do you have to add about the actual content of this message?
Rachel, we disagree with Mr. Larson and his approval of the letter's content. We find that the letter was missing two key elements. It didn't communicate a sense of urgency, and it didn't create accountability. In the Bovee and Thill text, we find that the first step of effective persuasion is to grab the attention of the audience. What we do see in Mr. Post's letter is his desired outcome, the change in policy. What we don't see is why. Why should the reading audience put this new policy into effect? The second missing element is accountability. As my colleagues have laid out, there was no personal relationship between Mr. Post and these executives. So there wasn't going to be any relationship-based or personal level consequence imposed. Furthermore, the letter didn't lay out any administrative consequences.
Franz, what do you think that Mr. Post could have done differently for the content of the memo?
First, in his letter, Mr. Post could have grabbed the attention of the factory executives by explaining the scope of the problem. We know that the manufacturing operations were spread between 20 factories. He should have explained that some factories were experiencing material shortages and that these shortages were impacting the crucial mission of the company to fill orders for the military. It was the duty of all factory executives to follow this new policy so that neither they nor their colleagues in other factories would run short of materials and fail to complete their orders. By explaining the urgency of the situation from a corporate level and how each individual's actions would help, he could have created buy-in from other factory executives. They would have known what was at stake with this new policy. Second, Mr. Post's letter did not outline any measures of accountability. In How to Improve Accountability in the Workplace in 5 Steps, Jeff Miller attempts to share that the fact that accountability or the lack of it sends the message to the rest of your team that lower standards are okay. We discover in the case study that the majority of the Dashman plants continued to perform their usual routines. The plants felt no pressure, nor were they presented with specific penalties or incentives that would avoid the dismissal of the new policy changes. In establishing accountability, Mr. Post's letter to his executives should have set clear consequences for any plant that failed to report contracts that exceeded $10,000. For example, a decrease in allocated funds for next year's marketing budget, or the immediate suspension of the executives who failed to notify accounts that went over the threshold. In contrast, Mr. Post could have also highlighted incentives that would have rewarded each plant that reported contracts over $10,000. Providing incentives or rewards are excellent ways to earn buy-in from your target audience. Rachel, by first grabbing the attention of the audience and then including accountability in his letter, Mr. Post would have shared a more persuasive message and been more likely to receive 100% participation across the company.
Franz and Sean, thank you so much for the insight. In conclusion, to ensure compliance with the new purchasing contract, Mr. Post should have evaluated his audience, his method of delivery, and the content of the message. Based on the findings of this panel, he failed to do all three. He should have realized there was a need for face-to-face communication based on the attitude of the audience towards the message that he was delivering. Additionally, written communication was not the best form of communication due to his lack of relationships with the current purchasing managers as well as the time of year prior to peak purchasing season. There were also opportunities with the content of his message. He failed to explain the whys so that there was buy-in from his key stakeholders. He also failed to outline accountability processes for failure to follow the new purchasing guidelines. Back in Black believes that if he combined all of our suggestions, it would have resulted in effective communication and action by the plant managers.